Look what we have here. Someone's little sister get lost on her way to the admin building. The crowd of hardened Marines, their faces a mixture of sun-baked leather and cynical amusement, offered a low ripple of laughter. They stood in the shimmering heat of the Afghan forward operating base, the air thick with the smell of diesel, dust, and spent cordite. The voice belonged to Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, a man whose personality was as loud and abrasive as the 50 caliber M107A1 rifle he was supposed to be demonstrating. He gestured with a theatrical sweep of his arm toward the figure standing alone near the ammunition crates. She was of average height, with a wiry frame that seemed almost lost inside her standard-issue fatigues. Her hair was pulled back in a severe regulation bun, and her face was a neutral mask, offering no reaction to the barb. She didn't flinch. She didn't scowl. She simply continued her task, methodically inspecting the links of a belt of ammunition, her fingers moving with a practiced, unhurried grace that was a universe away from the gunnery sergeant's blustering performance. This was Sergeant Eva Rostova, and her silence was a language Thorne was incapable of understanding. The assembled audience, a mix of seasoned infantry and a visiting delegation of top brass, shifted uncomfortably. They were here to witness the awesome power of the military's premier anti-material rifle, a weapon that could punch through an engine block from a mile away. They had expected a display of raw, masculine power, a symphony of controlled violence orchestrated by a master. Instead, they were getting a cheap sideshow with this unassuming sergeant as the target of the ringmaster's scorn. But when the four-star general standing on the observation platform, General Marcus Vance, saw her stance, he didn't see a lost clerk. He saw something else entirely. He saw a stillness, a centered calm that was profoundly out of place amidst the casual bravado of the range. He saw an economy of motion that spoke not of inexperience, but of thousands of hours of repetition. He saw a professional. The general narrowed his eyes, a flicker of memory stirring in the deep recesses of his mind. The way she held her shoulders, the way her eyes scanned the firing line without seeming to move, it was familiar, a ghost of a memory from a place of shadows and secrets. If you believe that true strength is found not in the volume of the voice, but in the precision of the action, type competence below. The demonstration was supposed to be the highlight of General Vance's visit, a tangible display of the lethal overmatch capabilities his forces possessed. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, a man who had qualified as an expert marksman once a decade ago and had dined out on it ever since, was in his element. He strode back and forth before the firing line, his voice a booming monologue on ballistics, windage, and the pure, unadulterated patriotism of sending a 660-grain projectile downrange at nearly 3,000 feet per second. He was a performer, and a massive black rifle resting on its bipod was his co-star. Sergeant Rostova, meanwhile, had been assigned the menial task of prepping the ammunition and assisting the primary shooter, a young, cocky corporal who looked like he'd been born with a rifle in his hands. Rostova worked in a small bubble of silence, her focus absolute. She wiped each massive cartridge with a dry cloth, checking for imperfections in the brass casing, ensuring each round was seated perfectly in its link. Her movements were a fluid dance of methodical precision, a stark contrast to Thorne's swaggering. He saw her quiet diligence not as professionalism, but as timid subservience, and it fueled his condescending tirade. "Hey, admin," he barked, not even bothering to use her rank. "Make sure you don't get any of your paperwork dust on my ammo. This is for professionals again." A few sycophantic chuckles from the younger Marines. Again, Rostova offered no reply. She simply slid the freshly inspected belt into its ammunition can, the metallic clicks of the rounds seating themselves the only answer she provided. The isolation was a palpable force, a wall built of Thorne's arrogance and the crowd's complicit silence. She was an outsider, an anomaly. In this world of overt strength and aggressive posturing, her quiet competence was mistaken for weakness, her stillness for fear. She was invisible to them, a background character in their story of martial prowess. They saw a small woman in a dusty uniform and made 1,000 assumptions, each one a brick in the wall of their own ignorance. They did not see the calloused pads on her fingertips, worn smooth from the cold steel of 1,000 different trigger guards. They did not see the faint web of scars on her forearms, souvenirs from hasty exits through shattered windows in forgotten cities. They did not see the ghost of a mil-dot reticle that was permanently etched into her vision, a phantom grid she used to measure the world around her. They saw only what their prejudice allowed them to see, and so they saw nothing at all. The moment of truth arrived. The target, the engine block of a captured technical truck, was positioned on a barren hilltop a staggering 1,800 meters away. It was a shimmering speck in the heat haze, an impossible distance for all but the most elite marksmen. The young corporal, the designated shooter, swaggered to the firing line. He settled in behind the M107A1, his movements just a little too fast, a little too eager to impress. Thorne stood over him like a proud father, barking final instructions. Mind the wind, son. It's gusting from the west. Hold 2 mils left and watch your breathing. The corporal adjusted his scope, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle erupted with a deafening concussion that slammed into the chests of the onlookers, a physical manifestation of its power. A cloud of dust kicked up from the muzzle brake, obscuring the view for a moment. Downrange, a puff of dirt exploded a good 10 feet to the right of the target. A collective groan went through the crowd. The corporal, his face flushed with embarrassment, quickly reloaded. He fired again. This time, the round went high, ricocheting off the rocks above the engine block with a metallic shriek. Thorne's face darkened. His perfect demonstration was turning into a public failure. It was then that General Vance's voice cut through the tense atmosphere, transmitted via his aide's radio. Gunny, your shooter seems to be having trouble with the conditions. Perhaps someone else should try. Thorne's jaw tightened. It was a direct critique of his coaching and his choice of marksmen. His eyes scanned the line of Marines, all of whom suddenly found the gravel at their feet intensely interesting. No one wanted to be the next one to fail in front of a 4-star general. Then a thought, cruel and opportunistic, sparked in Thorne's mind. He would make this a lesson. He turned, a malicious grin spreading across his face, and pointed directly at the one person who had remained silent and apart from the entire spectacle. All right, he boomed, his voice dripping with sarcastic magnanimity. Let's give the sergeant a chance. Let's see what the admin pool can do. He was setting her up to fail, to be the final, humiliating punctuation mark on an already disastrous demonstration. He wanted to prove his point, that this was a world for warriors, not for quiet, unassuming women who didn't belong. He expected her to refuse, to stammer an excuse. He was wrong. Sergeant Rostova looked up from her work, her expression unchanged. She gave a single, curt nod. Without a word, she rose and walked toward the firing mat. The Marines parted before her, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity on their faces. Thorne made a great show of handing her to the colossal rifle. Careful, Sergeant, he sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She kicked a little harder than a typewriter. Rostova ignored him. She took the weapon, her hands finding their purchase on the pistol grip and barrel shroud with an unnerving familiarity. The rifle, which weighed over 30 pounds, seemed to become an extension of her own body. She lay down on the mat, not flopping into position like the corporal had, but flowing into it, a single fluid motion that ended with her perfectly aligned behind the weapon. The buttstock settled into the pocket of her shoulder, as if it were custom molded for her. Her preparation was a silent, hypnotic ritual. Her left hand adjusted the bipod legs, canting the rifle slightly to compensate for the uneven ground. Her right hand moved to the scope, her thumb and forefinger dialing the elevation and windage turrets with a series of precise, audible clicks. She wasn't guessing. She was calculating. She took a small, weather-worn notebook from her pocket, her dope book, and flipped it open. Her eyes scanned the columns of data she had meticulously recorded over years of practice, cross-referencing range, temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure. She made one final, minute adjustment to the windage knob. Then she closed the book and placed it beside her. She chambered around, the sound of the heavy bolt sliding home echoing in the now complete silence that had fallen over the range. The crowd held its breath. Thorne stood with his arms crossed, a smug look on his face, waiting for the inevitable miss. Rostova's eye was pressed to the optic. Her breathing slowed, becoming deep and rhythmic. In holdout, In holdout, the world outside the circular view of her scope ceased to exist. There was only the reticle, the shimmering target, and the invisible river of wind flowing between them. She exhaled slowly, her body becoming as still as the rocks around her. At the very bottom of her breath, in the natural respiratory pause where the human body is most stable, her finger tightened on the trigger. The M107A1 roared. The concussion wave washed over the spectators, but this time it felt different. It felt clean, precise. It was not a roar of brute force, but the sharp, declarative statement of a master. A split second later, the spotter next to the general, his own high-powered scope trained on the target, gasped. He fumbled with his radio, his voice cracking with disbelief. Hit, he stammered. Direct hit, but he wasn't finished. He zoomed in, his knuckles white on the focus wheel. Wait, dear God, it's not just a hit. The round went straight through the magneto housing. It's a 1 in a million shot. That's not possible. The engine block, which should have been just dented or cracked by the impact, had a perfectly clean, half-inch hole drilled through its most critical component. It was a surgical strike performed with a sledgehammer. The silence that followed was absolute, a deafening void where Thorne's arrogance used to be. He stared downrange, his mouth hanging open, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending shock. He looked from a vapor trail still hanging in the air to the quiet sergeant calmly ejecting the spent casing. He uttered the only words he could form. No way. That's not possible. A heavy pair of boots crunched on the gravel, each step a deliberate, authoritative beat that broke the spell of stunned silence. General Marcus Vance descended from the observation tower, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the still-smoking rifle. He walked directly toward the firing line, his gaze fixed on the small, quiet sergeant who was now methodically clearing the weapon. He bypassed the petrified gunnery Sergeant Thorne as if he were a piece of range equipment, his presence utterly insignificant. The general stopped directly in front of Sergeant Rostova as she rose from the firing mat, the massive rifle held expertly in a low-ready position. As she stood, the collar of her uniform jacket, which had been slightly askew, shifted back into place. And that's when the general saw it. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't covered in gold or jewels. Pinned just below her standard marksmanship badges, almost hidden in plain sight, was a small, understated pin. It was a simple silver disc no bigger than a dime, with a stylized image of a striking serpent coiled around a surveyor's tripod, its single eye a tiny, polished obsidian chip. To the uninitiated, it meant nothing. It was a trinket, a personal affectation. But to General Vance, and to a very small, very select community within the global military establishment, that simple pin was more prestigious than the Medal of Honor. It was a symbol of a ghost, a legend. It was the unofficial unit crest of the Joint Special Operations Command's secretive sniper Overwatch element, a group so classified they were rumored not to exist at all. They were known only by their call sign. Spectre, the general, who had spent a decade at the helm of JSOC, felt a jolt of recognition so profound it was like being struck by lightning. He froze mid-stride. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a detonator. The calm, the methodical precision, the impossible shot. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. It was a signature. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on the small silver pin, his voice a low, reverent whisper that was meant only for her. The serpent's eye, he breathed, the name of the badge a half-forgotten secret on his tongue. Rostova met his gaze for the first time. Her eyes, which had seemed so neutral and unassuming before, now held a depth and intensity that was startling. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The general straightened up, his back ramrod straight, a storm of emotions crossing his face. Shock, then dawning comprehension, and finally, a deep and profound respect that bordered on awe. He turned to his aide, his voice now a command that cracked like a whip through the silent air. Captain, give me Sergeant Eva Rostova's service record. The full file. Omega level clearance. Now, the captain, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere, fumbled with his ruggedized tablet, his fingers flying across the screen. Security protocols were bypassed with the general's verbal override codes. A moment later, the file appeared. The general took the tablet, his eyes scanning the first few lines. He went utterly still. He looked up from the screen, not at Rostova, but the assembled crowd of Marines, at the humbled corporal, and finally, his gaze settling with the weight of an anvil upon the pale and trembling gunnery Sergeant Thorne. He began to read aloud, his voice clear and authoritative, each word a hammer blow against the foundation of their ignorant assumptions. Sergeant Eva Rostova, Unit of Assignment, U.S. Army Special Operations Command, attached to Joint Special Operations Task Force. Primary military occupational specialty, 18X, Special Forces candidate. He paused, letting the first revelation sink in. She wasn't even a Marine. She was Army Special Forces operating on their base. Previous assignments, he continued, his voice dropping lower. Task Force 121. Task Force 145. Mission history, entirely classified. Combat deployments. He trailed off, looking at the screen in disbelief before continuing. 17. The number hung in the air, an impossible figure that dwarfed the experience of every other person on that range combined. Awards include the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor Device, and the Distinguished Service Cross. He looked directly at Thorne now. Marksmanship qualifications. Master Sniper, U.S. Army Sniper School, Fort Benning. Graduate with honors, SOTIC, Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. Current assignment, he took a deep breath. Instructor, JSOC Advanced Marksmanship and Target Engagement School. Codename, Ghost. He lowered the tablet. The silence on the range was now a living thing, thick with shame and awe. General Vance turned back to Rostova. In a gesture that stunned every Marine present, the 4-star general, a living legend of the modern military, snapped to attention and rendered a slow, perfect salute to the unassuming sergeant standing before him. It was a salute of equals, a sign of ultimate professional respect. Sergeant Rostova, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Forgive me. Your reputation precedes you, but I failed to recognize you. It is an honor to have you on my base then. Without breaking his salute, he shifted his gaze to Thorne, his eyes burning with cold fire. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. You will report to my office at 1,400 hours. Today, you will learn a lesson that is more important than anything you can teach on this range. You will learn that competence is not loud. It is not arrogant. It does not need to announce its presence. True competence is silent. It is professional, and it proves its worth not with words, but with a single, perfect result. You are dismissed. The story of what happened on Range 7 that day spread through the forward operating base like a shockwave. It wasn't just gossip. It was the birth of a legend. It started with the Marines who had been present, their hushed, awe-filled whispers painting a picture of the quiet sergeant who had humbled a loudmouth gunny and shocked a 4-star general with a single, impossible shot. The tale was retold in the chow hall over trays of lukewarm food, in the barracks during late-night cleaning sessions, and in the hushed confines of the command center. The details shifted and grew with each telling. The range to the target stretched from 1,800 meters to 2,000, then to an unbelievable 2 kilometers. The target itself morphed from a simple engine block into the head of a bolt on the engine block. In some versions, she had made the shot blindfolded, using only the sound of the wind to guide her. But the core elements of the story remained inviolate and true. The gunny's arrogant dismissal, the sergeant's profound silence, the impossible precision of the shot, and the general's humbling salute. The legend of Ghost Rostova was cemented. She became a symbol, a cautionary tale for the arrogant, and an inspiration for the diligent. New arrivals to the base were told the story as a lesson in humility, a reminder that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you notice the least. The digital ripples spread even further. An after-action report, heavily redacted but detailing the unconventional demonstration of advanced marksmanship capabilities, made its way up the chain of command, eventually landing on desks in the Pentagon. The story was shared on secure forums and encrypted chat channels used by special operators across the globe. To them, it wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation. Eva Rostova was already a phantom legend in their circles, a master instructor whose skills were spoken of in reverent tones. The true punishment was the silent judgment he now faced every day. It was in the way the younger Marines, who once hung on his every word, would no longer meet his eyes. It was in the sudden quiet that fell over a conversation when he entered a room. The respect he had commanded, built on a foundation of volume and swagger, had evaporated in the space of a single rifle shot. His authority was a hollow shell. For weeks, he was a ghost on his own base, haunted by the memory of Rostova's calm face and the echo of the general's words. But the experience, as humiliating as it was, had cracked the armor of his arrogance. One afternoon, long after the dust had settled, he saw Rostova at the far end of the same range, patiently mentoring a small group of young snipers. She wasn't lecturing them. She was showing them, guiding their hands, adjusting their posture, speaking in a low, calm voice. There was no ego, no performance, only the quiet transfer of knowledge. Thorn watched for a long time, a war of pride and shame raging within him. Finally, he took a breath and began the long walk across the dusty range. He approached the group, stopping a respectful distance away. Rostova looked up, her expression as neutral as ever. The young Marines tensed, expecting another confrontation. Instead, Thorn cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Sergeant Rostova," he began, his voice uncharacteristically quiet, stripped of its usual bluster. I was wrong. What I said, there was no excuse for it." He finally looked up, meeting her eyes. "I've been teaching these kids to shoot for 5 years, but I've never seen anything like what you did. The way you read the wind. I was wondering if you would be willing to show me, to show us." It was a complete capitulation, an admission of his own inadequacy and a genuine plea for knowledge. Rostova studied him for a long moment. Then, she gave another one of her small, curt nods. "Of course, Gunnery Sergeant," she said, her voice simple and direct. "The wind is just a variable. The first step is learning to listen to it." She gestured to an open spot on the firing line, an invitation not just to learn, but to begin the long process of earning back his respect, this time on a foundation of genuine competence. The symbolic artifact of that day, the mangled engine block with a perfectly drilled hole through its magneto, was recovered from the hillside. It was cleaned and mounted on a heavy oak plaque and hung in the main entrance of the base headquarters. Beneath it, a simple, polished brass plate was inscribed with a quote attributed to the quiet sergeant, a quote that General Vance had overheard her telling a young Marine. It read, "Assumptions are heavier than recoil. Respect is lighter than air. Choose what you carry." Months bled into a year, and the seasons changed over the high desert landscape of the forward operating base. The incident on Range 7, once a raw and shocking event, slowly crystallized into institutional folklore. The range itself was now unofficially known by everyone on the base as Rostova's Ridge. The name was spoken with a kind of reverence, a geographical tribute to a moment that had fundamentally altered the culture of the entire installation. New soldiers and Marines arriving for their tours were taken to the headquarters lobby on their first day. They were made to stand before the mounted engine block, and a senior NCO would tell them the story of the quiet sergeant, the arrogant gunny, and the impossible shot. The story was no longer about embarrassing an individual. It had become a foundational parable about the core values of the professional soldier. It was a lesson in humility, a warning against the poison of prejudice, and a testament to the undeniable power of demonstrated competence. The change was most evident in Gunnery Sergeant Thorn. He was a different man. The volume was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity. He became one of the most effective instructors on the base, not because he was a master marksman. He knew he wasn't, but because he had mastered the art of humility. He taught his students that the most important tool in their kit was not their rifle or their scope, but their open mind. He would often bring his classes to the plaque and tell the story himself, using his own past arrogance as the ultimate cautionary tale. "I was the loudest man on this base," he would tell them, his voice raw with the memory. "And she was the quietest. I thought that made me strong and her weak. I learned that day that my voice was just noise, but her silence had weight. It had gravity. Don't ever make the mistake I did. Look for the quiet ones. Watch them. Learn from them. They're the ones who will teach you how to survive." The legacy of Sergeant Eva Rostova was not one of fame or public accolade. She was gone from the base as quietly as she had arrived, reassigned to another classified mission in another forgotten corner of the world. There were no parades, no official ceremonies in her honor. Her name would never appear in a newspaper or a history book, but her impact was more profound and lasting than any medal. Her legacy was in the subtle shift in the way soldiers looked at one another. It was in the new recruit who hesitated before judging a book by its cover. It was in the young officer who learned to listen to the quietest voice in a briefing room, understanding that it might hold the most valuable insight. It was in the hundreds of marksmen who were now being trained not just to shoot, but to think, to observe, and to respect the silent professionalism that was the true hallmark of an expert. General Vance, in his final address before retiring, spoke of that day on the range. He didn't mention names, but everyone knew who he was talking about. In a long and storied career, he said, his voice resonating through the large auditorium, I have seen countless acts of bravery. I have witnessed feats of strength and endurance that defy belief. But the single greatest display of strength I ever witnessed was an act of profound silence. It was the quiet, unshakable confidence of a true professional who knew their own worth and felt no need to announce it to the world. They simply let their actions speak. In the thunderous silence that followed, they taught us all what true respect looks like. True legacy, the narrator concludes, is not a monument of stone or a story carved in brass. It isn't what you leave behind in a physical sense, but what continues to move forward in the hearts and minds of others, because you were there. Sergeant Rostova's legacy wasn't the perfect whole she put in a piece of steel from over a mile away. It was the thousands of cracks she blasted in the invisible walls of assumption, arrogance, and prejudice. It was the quiet, unwavering standard of excellence that she embodied, a standard that now echoed across the ridges and through the barracks, a silent hum of competence that was louder and more enduring than any gunshot or any insult. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud ignorance, and where professional silence defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.